The United States has just received a harsh response. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent found himself in an awkward position after failing to convince China to make a deal. Washington arrived at the meeting in Stockholm confident in its power and expecting to pressure Beijing, but it all backfired. China did not back down. On the contrary, it began to resist even more firmly. What was meant to be a show of American strength instead revealed how much its position has weakened. China is fully aware that the US depends on it when it comes to rare earth metal supplies, trade, manufacturing, and more. And now, Beijing has begun turning that dependence into a weapon. Calm and self-assured, China is showing no signs of yielding to Washington. Meanwhile, panic is starting to spread in DC. The illusion that the US can still dictate terms to China is collapsing in real time. The whole world is watching, and China has not even blinked. It was meant to be a serious warning. If Beijing does not give in, American companies, farmers, and tech giants will start to suffer. Trump is rapidly running out of options, and the pressure is growing by the day. And on top of all that, the US was dealt another blow. BlackRock failed to close the Panama Canal deal. The deadline has already passed. This is a major setback. Since taking office in January, Trump had called the deal one of his top priorities. But despite all the fanfare and political promises, the US was unable to follow through. Now China has free rein again, and its influence is set to grow further. Let's take a step back. For years, Donald Trump's supporters proudly referred to the art of the deal as the key to global success. The formula was simple: apply pressure, make threats, play hardball, and always stay in a dominant position. Against countries with small economies and limited leverage, this tactic often worked. Trump raised tariffs, demanded new terms, and publicly humiliated his opponents. Many couldn't withstand the pressure and agreed to deals that favored the US, even if it devastated their own industries. Canada, Mexico, even the European Union, all eventually gave in. Washington's aggressive tone forced them to the negotiating table, where they had little choice. But there was a flaw in that strategy. It did not work on China. Trump's entire leadership style was built on coercion, not diplomacy. And while weak or dependent countries could be pushed around, China was neither vulnerable nor afraid. In fact, Washington's harsh rhetoric only strengthened Beijing's resolve. The European Union was a telling example. Despite being a bloc of 27 nations with one of the world's largest economies, it caved in under threats, tariffs, and behind-the-scenes pressure. Even the president of France called it submission. The EU made concessions that weakened its industry and agriculture, and in return, it got almost nothing. It was a one-sided deal that showed how fragile even the biggest alliances can be when the US chooses to push hard. Riding on that victory, Trump assumed he could force China to comply as well. But that's where everything went off track. Beijing refused to play by those rules. It responded calmly, firmly, and with full confidence. Trump made a major miscalculation. He assumed China would cave like Brussels, but instead ran into a wall, both political and economic, that could not be moved. A strategy that once brought quick wins no longer works. Washington is now at a loss. So let's rewind to April. That's when it became clear that America's usual pressure tactics would not work on China. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars, Washington was convinced that Beijing would yield. But it didn't. Instead, China hit back, imposed its own tariffs, and struck at the most vulnerable parts of the US economy: farmers, tech companies, and industry. And then Xi Jinping stepped into the game. Trump quickly realized he was dealing with a very different kind of leader, someone who could not be pressured. Even behind closed doors, Trump reportedly admitted that Xi was incredibly difficult to handle. Unlike many Western leaders who often yield to American pressure, Xi took a firm stand. China not only rejected the proposed terms, but launched a large-scale program aimed at reducing its dependence on the United States, especially in strategically important sectors. One of the key areas was rare earth metals. The US economy depends on them for nearly everything, from smartphones and electric vehicles to defense systems. And more than 60% of global supply is controlled by China. When tensions reached their peak, Beijing responded with precision. It restricted exports, reduced shipments, and sent a clear message. If the US continued to play hardball, the consequences would be tangible. And it was not just a response, it was a deliberate warning. And it worked. American defense companies began to sound the alarm over shortages of raw materials. Tech firms faced production delays. And within just a few weeks, the Trump administration backed down and returned to the negotiating table. China skillfully leveraged its pressure points and proved that it could not be intimidated. Meanwhile, American companies started to feel the strain. Apple, Tesla, Qualcomm, and major agricultural exporters began to lose ground in the Chinese market. Sales dropped, access was restricted. Beijing doubled down on local manufacturers and alternatives. The American businesses that once saw China as a gold mine now found themselves at a dead end. But it wasn't China that slammed the door shut. It was US policy that did it. The losses were so significant that many companies were forced to scale back their investments in China, simply because they no longer saw a future there. Farmers in the American Midwest were hit hard as well. China had been one of their biggest buyers, and that market disappeared. Soybean exports collapsed. Tech companies started drowning in rising costs as supply chains broke down. Washington might have thought it was playing tough, but it was American workers, farmers, and companies who ended up paying the price. Now, fast forward to the present. A new round of US-China talks is underway in Stockholm. Once again, the American delegation arrived with high expectations. Trump's team was determined to push through their terms and leave with a win, but reality turned out differently. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is now personally realizing what many others have already understood. China is not the European Union. If Europe folded under pressure, Beijing resists, stalls, and hits back on every front. These talks were supposed to be quick and decisive, but instead they've dragged on, and so far they have yielded no results. Even within Trump's own team, divisions have begun to emerge. Some advisors are urging him to ramp up the pressure, while others fear that one more aggressive move could collapse everything. Meanwhile, China is holding its ground. Beijing knows full well that this deal matters more to America than to China, and it is acting accordingly. This moment shatters the illusion that Trump's entire strategy was built on. It was never about the art of negotiation, it was about power and dominance. But once the balance shifts, once the other side gains real leverage, the strategy stops working. And that's exactly what is happening now in Stockholm. The tactic is failing, and Washington has no clear plan for what comes next. After 2 tense days of talks in Stockholm, the United States and China have agreed, at least verbally, to extend a fragile pause in their trade war and refrain from imposing new tariffs. This temporary truce was launched in May 2025 to halt the escalating conflict and was set to expire on August 12th. With that deadline fast approaching, both sides are under pressure. Either finalize a full agreement or risk returning to escalation. The problem is, nothing official has been signed yet. No agreements, no legal guarantees, just a verbal promise. And now everything hinges on one decision: Trump's. As of today, the United States continues to impose 30% tariffs on Chinese goods. China, in turn, maintains retaliatory tariffs at 10%. This pause was meant to create space for genuine negotiations, but in reality, it has become a political standoff teetering on the brink. The longer this uncertainty drags on, the clearer it becomes. The two sides are unable to find common ground. And while negotiations stall, another crisis looms on the horizon. Investment firm BlackRock, which was supposed to help the United States regain control over the Panama Canal, appears to have failed. The collapse of the port acquisition deal led by BlackRock has turned into a real geopolitical blow for the United States, especially after Washington had publicly thrown its full support behind it. BlackRock and MSC had agreed to purchase the global port business of C.K. Hutchison for nearly $23 billion. The deal included 43 ports in 23 countries, including 2 critical sites near the Panama Canal, Balboa and Cristobal. President Trump had called it a strategic victory, an opportunity to roll back Chinese influence, but the US was unable to finalize it. Chinese regulators and state-run media launched intense pressure. Beijing demanded that the Chinese shipping giant COSCO be included in the consortium, and Chinese media branded the deal a betrayal of national interests and a humiliating capitulation. When BlackRock and C.K. Hutchison failed to conclude the agreement within the exclusive negotiation period, everything stalled. The contract was never signed. For the United States, it was a catastrophic week in its increasingly intense struggle with China. First, Washington made concessions during trade negotiations in Stockholm. Then came the collapse of the Panama Canal deal. the very deal once hailed as a bold move against Beijing. In both cases, the US blinked, while China remained resolute. The message could not be clearer. America's influence on the global stage is waning, and China is seizing every opportunity to strengthen its position. So here's the real question. How much longer can the United States keep pretending to be the world's leader while China quietly pulls the strings behind the scenes? To stay updated on the next chapter in this unfolding story, like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.